My name is Bill Riden. I work for Penn State in the pesticide education program, and we work hand in hand with PDA, the Department of Ag, on the pesticide certification program. So this presentation, you will get 1 core credit for your pesticide certification. So let's get started. We called this presentation, Do You Get My Drift? So I'm hoping that by the end of this 30 minutes, you will get my drift. However, if you are a pesticide applicator, you certainly don't want everybody else to get your drift. If there's one common complaint from consumers when they see a pesticide applicator, it's going to be a drift issue. If they're going to complain to PDA, chances are it's a drift issue. So it is something that you need to be aware of, and make sure you're trying to do your best to reduce or eliminate drift. And as we go through this, I'm going to give you some hints and suggestions how you can reduce drift. You know, what is it? How do you reduce it? But basically, what is pesticide drift? It's a physical movement of a pesticide through the air. And you can see here in this boom, definitely too high a pressure, lots of small droplet sizes, and they're moving off site. But also keep in mind that the pesticide drift can happen not only at the time of application, but also after the pesticide application. So what happens is the pesticide is moving off target, off site. That is drift. It is going to where you don't really want the product to go. Okay. It's not a new problem. We've had pesticide drift ever since day one, but there certainly is a lot more potential for drift now. We have more acreage that's planted with herbicide-resistant crops, and that means more post-emergent applications. We're talking like Roundup-ready corn, Roundup-ready soybeans, lots of herbicides that are post-emergent, so when we see drift with these products, we see damage. Overspraying is not pesticide drift. You can see here on the right-hand side that boom is going out beyond the intended target. That's not drift, that's an overspray. And same thing, we see this with aerial applications. And get this to work here. Same thing, that's an overspray. Now we can break pesticide drift into 3 types. Spray drift, it's the off-target movement of a pesticide while we make a liquid application. You know, we're spraying the product on, and the pesticide is moving or drifting off-site. Particle drift is when we use a dust or granular application, and the dust is moving off-site. Now the other one that we don't always think about, but is very important, is called vapor drift. Basically, the pesticide is going into a gas, and that vapor is moving off-site. And again, that's going to be very dangerous. A good example would be if you are a grape grower. Grapes are very sensitive to 2,4-D and the phenoxy herbicides. You could be a mile away. Under the right conditions, those grapes will respond to that phenoxy vapor drift that you have. You get a hot day and the air is moving toward those grapes, you can certainly curl those leaves, and if you were closer, you could actually damage those plants from that phenoxy herbicide. Just about any pesticide can be prone to drift. Certainly there are certain ones that are more prone because of the vapor drift issue, but certainly any pesticide can be prone to spray drift. And this is the most common form of drift. Again, vapor drift, where we take that pesticide and we're getting vapors coming off, gases coming off, and they're moving off site. Typically, this is going to be during the application or soon after. So we get a revolatilization, if you will, and sometimes we do see this many hours after the application. The pesticide is drying, but the conditions are right. Maybe it's a hot, sunny day, and that pesticide is volatilizing and moving off-site. And again, it's more common with certain pesticides. Keep this in mind that as a pesticide applicator, you are responsible for pesticide drift, period. If PDA has to come in and investigate a complaint, you are responsible for pesticide drift. So make sure you understand the labels and also how to limit pesticide drift. Also, you know, no one's going to tolerate pesticide drift. I don't care if it's another farmer, another grower, the public, you know, whoever, they will not tolerate the effect of drift. Damage can be significant. You may be spraying a field and maybe your neighbor has damage on his crop because of your pesticide application. Certainly illegal pesticide residue on an adjacent food crop. And what we're saying here is, let's say you're spraying a pesticide and your neighbor has a food crop that's not on the label of that pesticide. If those residues show up on that food crop, that's an illegal application, and he may have trouble actually selling the fruit or vegetable off of that crop because of those residues. So keep that in mind. And certainly fish and wildlife kills, including honeybees. Right now within EPA, the number one concern when it comes to pesticides is protecting our pollinators. About 1/3 of our food supply is because we have pollinators, and those pollinators pollinate those crops. You wipe out the pollinators, you wipe out about 1/3 of our food supply. So it's a very important issue, and like I said, it's number one in EPA on their pesticide concern list. Number two, by the way, is pesticide drift. Human health can be adversely affected, and it could result in regulatory fines, legal liability, and litigation. So you are held responsible. Now the other thing is, let's say you're making a pesticide application, you are a conventional grower, but right next to you there's an organic grower. And if you're using a pesticide that's not considered organic, and that product drifts onto the organic farm, guess what? That organic farmer could lose his organic certification for 3 years because of your misapplication. So that's a very serious problem. Probably you're going to end up in court if that does happen. So again, be aware of that. Drift can be very, very costly. Okay, the bottom line is you must apply a pesticide according to the label. I mean, you hear us say time and time again, the pesticide label is the law. You need to follow that and make sure that you're making the application in the right manner. It's illegal to make an application of a pesticide resulting in off-target movement. Drift is not tolerated, like I said earlier, by anybody, whether it's the agricultural community or the regulatory community. And whether or not damage or harm has occurred, drift is illegal. So don't think that, well, I don't have drift because I don't see any damage. If somebody complains and they can prove that that pesticide moved off target to their property, that's an illegal application resulting in the drift. So you don't have to see damage for it to be proclaimed illegal drift. Now, some of the factors affecting spray drift. Certainly droplet size is probably the number one factor, and that's going to come back to nozzle selection. One of the best things you can do is get a catalog from the nozzle manufacturers. Whether it's T-Jet or any of the other ones, they have a catalog, and you look on there and say, okay, I'm using this nozzle, my pressure coming out of that nozzle is 40 psi. It will tell you what that droplet size is for that pressure in that nozzle. So now you go back to your pesticide label, the label is going to say the preferred droplet size is this. Maybe it says a medium droplet size. So you look at your nozzles, your pressure, am I producing the droplet size that the label is suggesting? The manufacturers are testing droplet sizes to see what works best. Oftentimes it's a matter of coverage. Let's say a fungicide. You need a droplet size that's going to give you good coverage, okay? So again, take a look at the pesticide label. What is the droplet size? Go to your nozzle catalog. Do you have the right nozzle on there for that droplet size? If not, something needs to change, whether it's pressure or the nozzle type and size. So here in this illustration, we see the small droplet. It's going to be affected by wind speed and direction. It's going to move off site. Certainly the larger droplet, it's going to be easier to hit the target. Now the problem with larger droplet size, if the label says you need a small to medium droplet size, if you go too large, you may not have the coverage that you want on the plant material you're trying to spray. A good example would be a fungicide, a contact fungicide. You need good coverage. So it's a compromise between drift in some cases and trying to get the right coverage that you need. But again, put all those factors together, the pesticide label, the nozzle output, and what the droplet size is. Certainly wind speed and direction play a major role, and also boom height. The higher you go on a boom, the more likely you will have drift. And that makes sense. You go up higher, has more likelihood to move off-site. So how far will drift go? This is in a 3 mile per hour wind, and you see the very fine droplet, what we say 20 microns. It will actually travel 1,100 feet. And it takes about 4.2 minutes to travel 10 feet. So you can see that we're very prone to fall 10 feet, but it will travel 1,100 feet in that time. You get down to a medium droplet size, 240 microns. It takes about 6 seconds to fall that 10 feet, but it'll travel 28 feet. So you can see that from a coarse droplet size to very fine, huge difference in the amount of distance that droplet can travel. Okay, let's go to vapor drift. The volatility of the chemical. Obviously, the more volatile it is, the more likelihood it will go to a gas and move off-site. The higher temperatures certainly increase the volatility and the movement of that gas, and certainly lower humidity. I often tell the story that when I grew up as a kid, I lived in a farmhouse, and we had the old radiators, and in the wintertime, the house would get very dry. So what my mother would do is she would take aluminum pie pans, put them on the radiators, put water in there to increase the humidity in the house. Now, what increased that evaporation of that water? Certainly the temperature of the radiator. When it kicked on, we had a higher temperature, more water evaporated quicker, and it produced the higher humidity. Now, she never did this, but if she had a fan there, she could increase the volatility or the evaporation of that water also by blowing air across that. Same thing happens with your pesticides. You get a lower humidity like what's in that house in the wintertime, low humidity, things are going to be more volatile, the water is going to evaporate quicker. Higher temperatures is going to kick up the evaporation or the volatility, and you get those moving off-site. So here you see the application, and through time, it's going to leave that plant and move off-site. That's vapor drift. And here we see an illustration. We came in, we made the application, and again, the product's going to vaporize, volatilize, and then move off-site. And in some cases, that off-site movement could cause damage if that product is not labeled on that crop. Okay, other factors, certainly the pesticide product, site conditions, weather conditions, application equipment. We're going to touch on that too because they now have nozzles on the market that are meant to reduce drift, and they really do a nice job, and we're going to get into that here in a few minutes. Pesticide product. Oftentimes the same active ingredient is made in different formulations. So understand the formulation, and if you're looking at drift, understand which formulation is more volatile. A good example would be in the herbicides. When we go to an EC, emulsifiable concentrate, we often see greater volatility and more danger of vapor drift. So the formulation type plays a part. Make sure you read the label for specific warnings. Maximum temperature. It may say do not apply above 85 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a reason for that. It probably has to do with volatility. And soil incorporation. We see this in the agronomic world. There are herbicides that must be incorporated, otherwise the UV light breaks them down and you really have a very short residual. And there's your active ingredients and a formulation type. Site conditions, always identify sensitive areas. This could be susceptible crops, beehives, wetlands, bodies of water, residential dwellings, or things like schools and hospitals. These are all sensitive areas. If you're making an application close to these, you need to be aware, am I taking the right steps to avoid that pesticide going on to these sites? The topography, we often see microclimates where the conditions are different even on the same property. Sometimes the topography, we see temperatures inversions happening. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, how actually temperature inversions can be a bad time to make an application. And certainly we see certain topography channeling drift, like this low area here. If you made an application up here, the pesticide would have a tendency to drift down to that lower spot, down slope. Keep in mind the application conditions, the weather conditions are rarely perfect. We like to see applications made between 3 and 8 miles per hour wind speed. Anything above 8, you're probably too windy. You're going to have lots of off-target movement. So keep that in mind. The other thing is, did you know you can actually go on the internet, for those that use the internet, that you can actually get a wind forecast for days ahead of time? So let's say you want to spray tomorrow. You can sit there in the evening and say, okay, what's the wind speed going to be tomorrow? So you can actually see a wind speed prediction in the weather reports. Wind is obviously the most common contributor to pesticide drift, so beware of not only wind speed, but wind direction, especially if you have those sensitive sites that you're trying to avoid. And this is what I was saying, apply between 3 and 8 miles per hour. Any more than 8, it's too windy. Any less than 3, there's actually the chance of a temperature inversion. Blowing in a direction away from sensitive areas. And again, make sure of downwind areas that could be very sensitive. Here's what we're saying about a temperature inversion. Most of you have seen this happen. You see smoke coming out of a chimney or someone burning something. The smoke goes up and it seems to form like a ceiling. Just kind of levels off. And that's what you see there on the right-hand side. You know, it just kind of goes up. And what's happening is you have warm air over cool air. So the smoke goes up and has no place to go. It's being blocked by that warmer air. Normally what we see is warmer air at the surface and we go up to cool air. The smoke will just keep rising and dissipate. But what happens is in a temperature inversion where you go out and it's just perfectly calm. You make an application and what happens, you get a concentrated cloud of very fine droplets. And what will happen, they will remain suspended for a very long time, but they also have a tendency to move off site. So even though it sounds strange that you say, don't spray when there's no wind, if there's no wind, there's a good chance that we have a temperature inversion like this. Now, the good thing is we don't see a lot of temperature inversions. I mean, it's not a very common factor. The bad news, you may not realize there's one there unless you see smoke or something out there that's going to give you a clue that perhaps we have a temperature inversion. But just let it be known that zero wind is not good for pesticide applications because of this phenomena. Your application equipment, make sure it's in proper order. Certainly anything leaking out of that sprayer is prone to moving off site, so make sure you don't have any defective parts, any leaks. Make sure everything is working in a correct manner. Nozzles are designed to control the flow rate, but also the droplet size, and they're going to disperse the droplets into very specific patterns. And this is one area that you can really reduce your drift. Now keep in mind that when we cut the droplet size in half, we actually result in 8 times the number of droplets. So let's say, for example, you have a tennis ball, and let's say that that's 500 microns. When we cut that in half, we have 250 micron, but we have 8 times the droplets. We cut that in half, we now have 64 marbles at 125 microns. Same volume, but we're actually, by cutting the droplet size in half, we're producing a lot more droplets. Now, the good news, if you're trying to get good coverage, this is going to give you better coverage than, say, this. Problem is, when it comes to drift, this is going to give you more drift than what these other larger ones are going to be. So again, picking the right droplet size for the application is one of the take-home points I'd like you to remember. Okay, there it goes. Fine droplets we consider less than 150 microns. We do get better coverage and penetration through a canopy where that's necessary, but they are more prone to drift and evaporation. Large droplets we consider above 350 microns. You have less chance of drift, but certainly you have fewer droplets and we may miss the targets. If you're spraying a herbicide and you're trying to get good coverage on those weeds, you certainly don't want to go too large that you miss that coverage. More prone to bounce on leaf surface. We don't often think about this, but a large droplet, when it hits that weed leaf, it has a likelihood to bounce off. So you don't get the sticking on that leaf, you don't get the absorption, you don't get the control. So not only do we have less coverage, we have more prone to bounce. And here you see a 600 micron droplet will actually bounce 8 times more than what a 300 micron droplet will bounce. Sometimes we do put adjuvants in there to help reduce bounce. Your spreader stickers oftentimes are used for that. Okay, droplet size issues. Again, it depends upon the application. And what you're going to see here, this is a contact material. Wherever that droplet hits, that's where our control is going to be. So that's a contact. We go to a systemic material. We let the plant, if you will, disperse that material. So even though it's hit just a small droplet on there, we see greater movement, and this would be considered a localized systemic. And then a truly systemic would be more like this, where it hits the plant, but it's going to be totally distributed through that plant. So our coverage is less critical on a true systemic as opposed to a contact material. So pay attention to nozzles. We're trying to get uniformity of output, and we're trying to make sure that we have the right nozzle for droplet size. You should have uniformity across if you're using a boom sprayer, have uniformity across that boom. Those nozzles should be within 5% of the average output of all the nozzles in that boom. If any of them vary by more than 5%, you should be replacing those nozzles, and probably you should be replace all the nozzles at one time, put all nozzles on there, and make sure you had that uniform distribution coming out. And here you see a whole bunch of droplets or nozzle types. Wind buffers, drift control additives can be used. This is what I would say would be my last choice. I think you need to do everything else before this, but certainly they do have drift control additives out there that make the spray droplets heavier and they're less likely to move off site. But when you do your calibration, you have to do your calibration with these drift control adjuvants added to your water because they are thicker and you may change your calibration. Okay, this is kind of a summary of all the techniques for reducing drift. Again, go back to the labeled directions, proper nozzle and pressure combination, select a nozzle to increase droplet size. If you can, again, read the label, you may have to go to a smaller droplet size. Consider using new technologies. Drift reduction nozzles. They have nozzles out there. If you replace, let's say you're using a flat fan. If you use some of these drift reduction nozzles, you can reduce your drift 50% just by switching to this type of nozzles. Now, having said that, the disadvantage is they're going to cost you more money. They're a little more difficult to clean. They're not just a straight through nozzle. They often have ventures or openings that suck in the air to make these droplet sizes. So it is more expensive. The nozzle bodies may not be the same size, so you may have to make a little bit of investment to switch over. But the big advantage is you can reduce the drift by at least 50% by just switching to some of these drift reduction nozzles. Lower boom height, as we talked about, certainly as we drop the boom, we have less chance of drift. Now, when you do that, make sure you have the right nozzles in there to have this even coverage across the boom. And you may have to change your spray angle, but certainly that is a possibility to reduce drift. Appropriate travel speed, if you're using a boom sprayer, don't go so fast that that boom is bouncing, because when that boom bounces, you're going to see a lot more drift coming off that boom than if you have a nice steady speed that it's not bouncing on you. Okay, avoid application during times of high wind and speed, makes sense. We talked about that. Do not spray in the presence of temperature inversion, we talked about that. Consider buffer zones. We didn't really go into that, but oftentimes if you have a sensitive area that you're trying to avoid, have a buffer zone that's kind of like a no spray zone. You're not going to go as close to that sensitive area as what you might think, so you want to stay back and have that buffer zone. And maybe the vegetation's even different. Oftentimes on farmland, we'll allow a buffer zone where the vegetation is basically grass, but it's let to go a little bit higher so it catches a lot of the drift before it goes off site. And the same thing with runoff. If you have a buffer zone, oftentimes that buffer zone will keep runoff from going off site as well. So we do see buffer zones in some cases. I had an orchard up in, I think it was Berks County a few years ago. Early morning air blast sprayer. He's out there spraying. very little wind, ideal conditions. He comes by, but across the street, there was a residential area. And it's early in the morning, here comes the school bus. And right behind the school bus is one of the kids' parents sitting there waiting for the kids to get on the bus. Well, here comes the air blast sprayer, and the person in the car could see the drift coming across, hit the side of the school bus. And guess what she did? She called PDA and said, I just saw this pesticide hit the side of the school bus, and she complained. Well, long story short, what the orchard grower eventually did, he put a row of quick growing trees in there more as a buffer. So anything that was moving off site would never get across the road. It would hit those trees and block it from going off site. But also keep in mind, if somebody sees a pesticide drifting, they have no idea what that pesticide is. I mean, you could be spraying a fertilizer for all that matters, but they see, oh my, it's a dangerous pesticide, I'm gonna call PDA and complain. So keep that in mind that, people have different viewpoints when they see a pesticide being applied and if it's moving off site. And again, last choice would be a drift control additive if needed. Again, I would consider this my last choice, but certainly they can be used and it does reduce drift. Okay, questions for me on drift. That was kind of a quick whirlwind tour, but the main points are be conscious of it. You are responsible for drift. Take a look at the drift reduction nozzles, and so make sure you think about drift.
Okay, quick question, yes.
With drift control additive, lessen the coverage saying as a larger drop size nozzle would.
Yeah, the drift additives.
Repeat the question.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. The question was, does a drift reduction additive, surfactant, adjuvant, make a larger droplet size? And the answer, yeah, they typically make a heavier, a little bit larger droplet size, but it's more also a weight thing where it's a little bit heavier moving. But that's also why you need to calibrate your sprayer if you're going to use that, because it could change your calibration. Like I said, they do work, but I'd like to see you go through the checklist before you get to that point.
Okay, one more question for Bill? All right.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, let's give him a hand.